What you are about to hear is a fictional narrative account, reconstructed from unverified versions and theories, created exclusively for entertainment purposes. The full truth may never come to light. Ricardo had always considered himself a balanced man. Married to Isabella for over a decade, he believed his life was under control. Together, they had built a solid story, faced challenges, and overcome obstacles. Isabella, the woman he called his partner, was everything he ever desired: affectionate, dedicated, and always present. A true companion. They shared a life of love, respect, and trust, and everyone around them believed that their marriage was a reflection of an unbreakable union. But what Ricardo didn't know was that, behind the facade of stability, a shadow was silently growing. According to reports, everything started to change when Juliana was hired as a secretary at Ricardo's office. She was young, vibrant, and full of energy. Juliana's way, with her charming smile and gentle words, captivated everyone around her. But it was Ricardo who found himself especially drawn to her presence. He tried to hide what he felt, justifying that she was merely a colleague, but something inside him told him that their relationship was about to transform. Some versions suggest that, at first, everything seemed purely professional. Juliana, with her polite manner and desire to please, never hinted that anything beyond a working relationship could occur. However, as the days passed, Ricardo began to realize that his feelings for her were not just professional admiration. He didn't know if it was the way she looked at him, how their bodies accidentally met, or the fact that he felt more alive in her presence than with anyone else. But something was happening. His relationship with Isabella started to be put to the test. The truth was that Ricardo didn't want to admit to himself what he was feeling. He loved his wife, but for some reason, he found himself attracted to Juliana in a way he couldn't control. When the couple began to have difficulties in their marriage, the small gestures from Juliana started to seem even more inviting. She was always around, ready to help, listening to him attentively, and little by little, their conversations began to extend beyond words. It wasn't anything explicit, but the emotional tension was in the air, making it impossible for Ricardo to ignore it any longer. That day, like so many others, seemed normal at first. Ricardo was leaving for yet another meeting, and as always, Juliana offered to help him with some work details. However, that seemingly harmless encounter was the trigger for an irreversible change. Some reports suggest that afternoon, there was a moment of frustration between the two, a confusion at work, a harsh word, something that made the chemistry between them explode. They were alone in the office, and unknowingly, what started as a small exchange of glances turned into something more intense, more urgent. What happened next was a mistake they would both make, but that Ricardo, in particular, would never be able to forget. That night, when he came home, Ricardo's life had already changed forever. He found Isabella in the living room, doing something routine, as if nothing had changed. She greeted him with a warm smile, and he, unsure of how to act, returned the smile but with a sense of emptiness inside. The weight of his betrayal still consumed him, and the idea of facing Isabella, of looking into her eyes, seemed impossible. He sat down, tried to talk, but the silence between them was palpable. What Ricardo didn't know was that the night that followed would begin to reflect the torment he felt. He tried to convince himself that he had made that mistake just once, that it was a momentary weakness, but something inside him told him that this was not just a simple flaw. He knew that, by doing that, he had torn apart the veil of trust that Isabella had in him. The most painful thing for him was that, at the same time, remorse consumed him, but he also knew he couldn't undo it. As Isabella prepared to sleep, nothing seemed different. But for Ricardo, the darkness of that night was overwhelming. He lay beside her, felt the warmth of her body, but felt more distant than ever. That woman, whom he had always loved, was now much farther away than he could ever imagine. He knew that from that moment on, everything would change. Guilt took over his mind, but Ricardo still didn't know how to confront it. His marriage seemed about to collapse, and the image of Juliana, who once seemed like just a coworker, now consumed him in ways he didn't know how to handle. The tension was rising, but he didn't have the courage to tell the truth to Isabella. He wanted to forget, but he couldn't. What terrified him the most was knowing that, no matter how hard he tried to deny it, the consequences of it all would soon be revealed. As the days went by, Ricardo found himself increasingly distant from Isabella. He tried to maintain the appearance of normalcy, but the pressure of his own mistake began to make him a different person. He was no longer the same man who woke up next to Isabella every day with a smile on his face. Now he woke up with a feeling of oppression in his chest, knowing he had betrayed the trust of the one he loved most. The shadow of regret was his constant companion, and he could barely bear the weight of guilt. Isabella, perceptive as always, began to notice the changes in Ricardo. He was no longer as affectionate as before, and his responses, when he spoke, seemed mechanical. She tried to start conversations, but he was always lost in his own thoughts. She knew him like no one else, and something in the way he behaved made her suspicious that he was hiding something. However, she didn't want to believe it. She didn't want the shadow of a betrayal hanging over her marriage. She loved Ricardo, and as much as something told her that something was wrong, she preferred to believe that he would never do such a thing. But the situation became unbearable. More and more, Ricardo felt like he was sinking into a lie he didn't know how to fix. What started as a mistake made in a moment of weakness was now turning into a spiral of guilt, and he didn't know how to get out of it. Juliana, with her bold and provocative behavior, continued to haunt him. She knew she had power over him, and that made him feel even more helpless. No matter how hard he tried to stay away from her, he couldn't avoid the daily encounters at work. She was there, always close, with her smiles and subtle gestures that left him vulnerable. Meanwhile, the distance between Ricardo and Isabella grew. She felt that something was wrong, but couldn't quite identify what. There was a growing coldness between them, and she knew something was about to break. But she refused to face the reality. She convinced herself that it was just a phase, that Ricardo was simply going through a tough time at work. However, the signs were there, and Isabella couldn't ignore them for much longer. Ricardo, in turn, was trying to convince himself that it would all pass. He still loved Isabella, and he saw himself struggling against his own feelings. The mistake he had made consumed him from the inside, but he still believed he could fix things, that the pain and regret would be temporary. But deep down, he knew things would never be the same again. Then one day, while Ricardo tried to maintain the facade of a man without worries, the worst happened. Isabella, in one of her attempts to start a conversation, asked a direct question that made Ricardo freeze. She looked at him with eyes full of expectation and asked, "Do you have something to tell me, Ricardo? Something I should know?" The simple question, but full of meaning, was the trigger. Ricardo didn't know what to say. The weight of the lie was too much to bear. He wanted to tell her everything, but didn't know how. The fear of losing Isabella, of watching everything he had built crumble before him, stopped him from speaking the truth. He knew she deserved to know, but at the same time, he feared that it would completely destroy their marriage. Isabella, sensing that something was wrong, insisted, "Ricardo, I can tell that you're distant. What happened? Are you hiding something from me?" That was when the guilt became unbearable. He knew he couldn't delay the truth any longer. But instead of telling everything in that moment, he shut himself off even more. He tried to avoid the conversation, making the silence between them even heavier. The tension continued to grow. Ricardo was about to explode. He knew that to save his marriage, he would have to face what he had done and deal with the consequences. But with each passing day, he felt more lost. He didn't know if he could ever regain Isabella's trust, or if it was already too late. He had crossed a line that he couldn't go back from. Ricardo's life continued to be a constant internal battle. He knew he could no longer live in that lie, but the fear of losing everything he had paralyzed him. The guilt he felt with every glance from Isabella, with every word he spoke, was eating him up inside. He wanted to fix everything, but he didn't know where to start. Then one day, during a normal workday, Ricardo had an encounter that would change everything. Juliana approached him, as she always did, but this time, there was something different in her gaze. She looked at him intensely, as if she knew exactly what he was feeling. She smiled in a way that seemed to acknowledge she had some power over him, and indeed, she did. Juliana approached Ricardo more boldly, with a clear intent to make him even more uncomfortable. She knew he was weakened by guilt, and that made her feel powerful. But in that moment something changed within Ricardo. He looked at Juliana, and for the first time realized how much she was manipulating his feelings. He was completely dominated by the situation. But that look from Juliana was what finally awakened something in his mind. He could no longer live this way. In an unexpected gesture, Ricardo pulled away from Juliana. He took a step back, and with a firm voice, said, "This is over. I can't continue with this anymore." Juliana, surprised by his reaction, tried to argue, but Ricardo had already made his decision. He knew he had to resolve his life, face the mistakes he had made, and above all, save his marriage. He couldn't continue living in a limbo of lies and betrayals. Ricardo went straight home. He knew the moment to confront Isabella had come. He could no longer hide the truth from her. When he entered the living room, he found Isabella sitting, looking at him with an expression of concern. She knew something was wrong, but she still didn't know the magnitude of what was about to be revealed. Ricardo sat down beside her, and with a trembling voice, said, "Isabella, I made a mistake. I made a grave mistake. Something that's going to hurt you. I cheated on you. I don't know how to apologize, but I need you to know the truth." Isabella looked at him, in shock. Ricardo's words were like a blow. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Tears began to roll down her face, as she tried to process the pain and betrayal. Ricardo, with a heavy heart, continued, "I have no excuses. Nothing I say will make this go away. But I love you and I want to try to fix everything. I know I can't undo what's been done, but I can fight for our love." Isabella, with tears in her eyes, remained silent. She didn't know what to do, or what to think. She needed time. What Ricardo didn't know was that his words had shaken everything she believed about him. Now everything was at stake. Cliffhanger: what happened next would change both of their lives forever.